Hey, what's going on everybody? Today's video is all about wheel hubs and bearings. And so have you ever been driving down the street and you hear that hum from the front end of your car and you think, oh, that's my brakes, that's my brake rotors, and then you realize it's your wheel hub. And so you go get it checked out and you find out that an OEM replacement is $250 or more for one hub. So then you go down the path of rebuilding it yourself and you find out a rebuild kit is around $150 for the set, which is a great deal. But now you can get a complete hub with bearings and grease for under $100, meaning that you can get two hubs complete for less than the price it would cost for one OEM hub. So that's a great deal. And so we're gonna take a look at this hub, check it out, put it on the car, and see how it performs. All right, so let's go ahead and open this up. Wow, look at that. Nice. Oh, we also have this extra bearing right here. Okay. So let's go ahead and take it out of the plastic here. So as you can see, this wheel hub is beautiful, looks great. So in the picture, in the description, it doesn't show whether it has grease or not. So you're kind of led to believe that it doesn't have grease and you have to go out and purchase your own grease. But this wheel hub does have grease, and it doesn't have too much though. As you can see, it's not like completely covered in grease, but you can see right there that there's grease right there. And on the back, you can't really tell, but there's grease. If you can see, those are the bearings right there. They're kind of sitting in grease. There we go, right there. Aside from that though, the hub looks really awesome, looks great. And so we'll set that aside. We have the small bearing. Let's go ahead and get this out of here. And you can see that that is well constructed as well. It's very nice. And it does not come packed with grease, so we're going to have to pack it with grease. And I'll explain how to do that. It's not too difficult. And there's a couple different ways. You can do it by hand, which is the way I'll show you, or you can buy a bearing grease packer. And they both do the same thing and they get the job done well. So let's get started and let's throw these on the car. All right guys, so here we have our optimal wheel hub bearing. We're gonna go ahead, open it up, take it out. Move the bearing. Okay, so now as you can see, we have that grease that's inside right there, right? So we don't want this grease actually, because we're gonna use our own grease, and it's very important not to mix greases just because they both have different properties, even though they can be you know, the same base material. There's other additives that can cause them to break down prematurely, and we don't want that. So we're going to go ahead and try to get as much of this old grease out as possible, and then we'll replace it with new grease. And then I'll also show you how to pack this bearing as well as we'll try to pack this inside bearing right here. You can see it, there we go, in there, you can see. So we're going to try to pack that without removing this seal, because if we remove the seal, then we'll have to replace it, and we don't want to do that, because the whole purpose of buying this is to just put it on the car without any more additional servicing. So let's go ahead and remove the grease, and we'll just look at that. Take that grease out. Make sure you have like a container or something to put it in. You could even put it in a Ziploc bag if you're going to throw it away. If you're not going to throw it away, then I would definitely put it in a container like this. Some would suggest, and I would suggest, I wouldn't disagree, but if you want to 100% get all the grease out, then I do agree with putting this in some type of solvent tank and really just getting all that grease out. But I think for this application here, it's okay because we're going to be using a similar grease. We're still using a lithium complex grease, so things aren't going to be too bad, just as long as we can get as much out of there as possible, and we'll be fine. Where it falls apart is when you have all this grease in here and then you just throw in more grease, or different grease I should say, without cleaning out all the old grease. And then that's when you kind of run into issues. So that's how much grease, pretty much that's how much grease was in the one hub, and so we're going to do that to both hubs. We're going to just, in a sense, degrease it. And we'll set that aside, throw this in the trash, get a towel here. And now we'll get some grease, and I'll show you how to pack this bearing. So pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to put some grease in this hand, we're going to take our bearing in this hand, and we're just going to scoop the grease like that all the way around until grease starts coming out the top of this. And then after that, we'll coat this whole bearing right here. Okay, so we're back, and here's the grease that I'm going to be using. It's Fuchs Renolet STTX, and this is a semi-synthetic ultra high performance grease. And yeah, I wanted to try this out and just really put it to the test. So I'll let you guys know how it works. And this is also from the same manufacturer that makes the famous green grease that Mercedes is known for. Mercedes has their own brand of grease that's green, as well as Febby. Febby makes a green grease. Fuchs makes a green grease. And I want to say, well, you know, I think they're all, you get the point. So I'm going to go with Fuchs. I've used their transmission fluid in the past, worked really well, so I'm going to stick with them, even though I have their thumbnail on my transmission video. I sent them an email about which grease to use. If you see in my other video where I'm just kind of testing a bunch of greases, I had some questions. I sent them an email. They never replied back. And I looked out for them, but they didn't look out for me. Holding back tears here. Kidding. But and this isn't a sponsored video. Fuchs didn't sponsor this or ask me to do any kind of like product placement. This is just something that I've done a lot of research on, and the numbers just kind of pointed to this particular grease in right here, the STTX, or the S2TX, I'm sorry. And so I wanted to try it out. I was real excited about it, and see how it's going to work out, and I'll let you guys know in a future video. So let's start packing. Okay, I don't like using grease guns, so I just pressed out all of the grease from this tube into this. So just a heads up, the ST2X, it is blue. And here we go. The really cool thing about the ST2X is it has a Timken load of 75 pounds. So that's pretty impressive. That's some extreme pressure grease right there. So let's just scrape off this top part and see if we can get away with that. So this is what we'll do. We'll just take a bunch of this grease, put it in our hand like this. Oops, like that. And then we'll just start packing like that. Just like that. And you just want to keep going until you get all that grease in there. And you just want to do like really small. You don't want to like do a big, you know, portion all at once, because it won't catch as, you know, well. You just almost want to just do like little millimeters at a time, like that, just a little bit. And then you can even scrape off this part and, you know, just go from there. But you don't want to take big chunks, just a little bit like that, just like that. And then you'll see here, see how it's, you see how the grease is starting to come out through the bearing. So you want to achieve this all the way around. So let's keep packing. So once the bearing is packed, just go ahead and coat the top part. Coat as much grease around the bearing as possible. We'll just slot this in here, just like that. And there we go. So now what we're going to do, that's how it'll go once we're ready to install it on the car. So in the meantime, we'll set that there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this back bearing here, as you can see this back bearing right there, and we're going to pack that with some grease, just a little bit of grease. And pretty much I'm going to just do the same thing. Take some grease here, and so I got my grease, and I'm just going to put some right in here and just do this. Just slide it and just okay, so now we got that packed. Now we're going to go ahead and put some grease on the inside between the two bearing races, and that way the bearings can draw grease as the wheel hub is spinning. If they need more grease, it's just a, you know, kind of extra precaution. So we're going to go ahead and fill this area that we removed all the old grease, and we're going to fill that with the new grease. Okay, cool. So now we have our grease inside the wheel hub. We have our bearing greased. We have the inside bearing greased. And then now what we're going to do, there's one more area that we're going to need to grease, and I will show you guys that once we install this onto the car. Okay, to get access to the caliper bolts, turn your wheels to the left and to the right. Next, we'll have access to our caliper bolts, and they're going to be the two bolts right there, and you're going to use an 18mm socket to remove those bolts. And I noticed that if I used a breaker bar type of ratchet, it worked best. Just gave me better leverage. Okay, now we're going to locate our brake pad sensor, and all you're going to do is just pull it out. You don't want to use too much force because you don't want to damage the wires, but it should just come out with minimal force. And then after that, we're going to locate our Torx bolt, which will be on the other side of the caliper, and we'll just use an E10 socket to remove that, and that shouldn't give you any trouble either. And then after that, we'll just go ahead and remove the bolt and then remove the sensor and then put the bolt back into its location just to save it. Okay, now we're going to remove those caliper bolts that we loosened earlier. That way, if you loosened them already, then that's okay, but I like to just leave them in just because it keeps the caliper in place until I'm ready to finally remove it. So from there, I'm just going ahead and just removing the bolts. And sometimes they can be a little tight, but if you lift up on the caliper, that can make them loose again. So that's just a little trick to keep in mind when you're removing the bolts. Then after that, just go ahead and be gentle removing the brake caliper, and you'll see the pads. And one thing I do recommend is to push the pads back in, and you can just use like a screwdriver or pry bar, or even your hands, and just push them in just a little bit, and that way when you go to put the caliper back onto the rotor, it'll go on smoothly, and you won't have any troubles. Next, grab your bungee cord and wrap it around the top of the strut tower, the A pillar, and from there go ahead and just hang your caliper. Go ahead and hook the bungee through the two caliper bolt holes. That's the best location that I've found. So now we're going to take our T25 Torx bit and remove the Torx screw that holds the rotor in place. And sometimes this can be a little tight. So use your Torx bit with a ratchet first, and if it's not coming out, then go ahead and use an impact driver and just give it a few hits, and that should free it up. So you might have to try a little bit, but it should come loose fairly easy. It shouldn't give you any problems. But those two methods seem to work best. After that, go ahead and unscrew it and set it off to the side, because we will use this screw later when we're measuring our end play. So go ahead and remove the rotor and set that aside. Now we have access to the hub. Okay, so here's the brake shield, and there's 3 Torx bolts that are holding it together. What I like to do is loosen them. Okay, so now we're going to remove our dust cap from the hub, and just use a pry bar and just go rotate and pry a little bit at a time until the cap comes off. You don't want to pry it off all at once. Now with the T-handle or a number 5 Allen wrench, just go ahead and loosen that locking nut, or the locking bolt, and then after that loosen the nut, and the nut should come off just like that. And as you can see, it is really dirty, and look at that grease. Boy, is it dirty. And it is just broken down and used. Okay, so now we can remove our hub. The hub should come off quite easily, and as you can see, we're going to want to clean off all of that old grease, and before we apply our new grease. We do not want to install our new hub with new grease over old grease. That's something you just don't want to do. Take notice that the holes on the hub are not drilled out completely. Whereas the new hub, the holes are drilled out, so that's really cool. Okay, so here we're just cleaning off all that old grease, and we're getting it nice and clean and ready for the new installation. Okay, so now we're going to remove that brake protector, the dust cover. And now since we've loosened it, we don't have to use any kind of ratchet or anything. We can just use our hands, and it just comes off really easily. You do have your speed sensor there, so if that's something that you want to remove, you can do so. Okay, so just doing some final touches on the cleaning process for the spindle here and the arm, and just making sure that we really get that clean, because we don't want too much dirt to mix in with our new grease. We really want to just kind of start fresh and new. So here I use just some basic degreaser. Okay, so now we want to use new gloves before we apply our grease. And I'm using the Renault S2TX. This is a semi-synthetic grease, and I know it's not the famous green grease that Mercedes is known for, or you guys are used to using, but this is the grease that I wanted to go with. And after looking at tons and tons of specs and all that stuff, this grease was very promising. So coat the spindle. I probably used too much grease here, but it's good for preventing, I guess, washout. If water gets in, it will just kind of prevent that corrosion, and just give it a little bit more protection. So now we got our dust cover nice and clean. So we're going to go ahead and put that back on, making sure not to touch the grease. We don't want to scoop up any grease. And then we'll just go ahead and tighten those bolts once more. Okay, so now we have our hub, and one thing I noticed with this hub when I was installing it and I had to remove it is that there's a little spring inside the seal, underneath the rubber seal, and it came out. And if that happens, you want to make sure that you put that spring back. And the best trick that I used was I used a screwdriver along with my dental pick, and I was able to get it back in. Okay, so now we're going to just seat the hub onto the spindle, and we're going to take the smaller bearing, and we're going to just install that bearing into the center like that, and be sure to apply grease to the inside part of the hub before we install the bearing. Okay, so now the bearing is in, and here I'm just going to clean that nut before we put on the nuts. So if you've seen my other video where I fix my ultrasonic cleaner, then yeah, you'll see that I'm really excited to use it. And if you have an ultrasonic cleaner, go ahead and just throw your nut in there, and it'll just clean it up pretty nicely. So just kind of letting you guys see how it works, and you can see the dirt just really just come off. But it's not magic, so after it's done, we're going to just take a toothbrush and just kind of finish it up. But as you can see, it does a great job just sitting in the tank, and that just really helps with getting out all that kind of like micro dirt and everything. So from here, just greasing up the bolt. We want everything nice and greased to prevent corrosion, especially after it's been sitting in the tank like that. It just really stripped the bolt of all the oils and everything like that, so it's easy for rust to creep in. So we want to make sure that everything is nice and greased. And from here, we're just going to go ahead and put that nut back on, and now we can start seating the hub, or we can, move on to seating this hub. And so that Torx bolt that we removed earlier, we're going to go ahead and put that back in, and then we're going to take a bolt, a wheel lug, and we're going to put it in on the opposite end of the Torx bolt. And that way it'll give us a nice even distribution of pressure so that the brake rotor doesn't move. And now we're going to seat this hub. So we do not want to use too much force. It's just very lightly, we're going to just tighten this nut very lightly as we're rotating the rotor. And we're just going to do that a few times. And I'm actually slowing down the rotor. The rotor isn't stopping because I'm tightening it so tight. It's just that I'm slowing it down. And so as you can see, that it's still rotating as I'm slowing it. And then after that, we'll just back it off half a turn, give it a good spin to make sure it's loose. Okay, so we'll set up our dial indicator with the magnetic base. I like to set it up on the very bottom, and this just gives better balance and everything like that. And so from there, then you're just going to go ahead and set the dial indicator up onto the spindle. And you're going to want to push in the plunger about a centimeter in, because what happens is if you just put the plunger on the spindle without any kind of distance, then when you go to make a measurement, it'll create a gap and you won't be able to get an accurate reading. So go ahead and push the dial indicator in a bit, and then from there tighten everything up. And after that, that'll give you accurate reading. And then from there you can just set it to 0, and just in this case it just set to 0, but if it doesn't set to 0, you can just rotate the outside ring, and you can achieve 0 that way. And then from there you'll use your fine adjustment knob to get exactly on 0 if you're having trouble not achieving 0. So that's what that knob is for. So now when we have 0, we can start making our measurements. And so what I like to do is I'll get the dial indicator set up, and I'll tighten the nut very gently. I mean, the moment you feel resistance is when you want to stop. You don't want to over tighten the nut. So just until you feel resistance, and this is after the hub has been seated. And then from there, you'll go ahead and you'll just check. You'll make a measurement, and you'll see that the needle won't move. And that's what we're looking for. We're just looking for like a baseline setup. And I'll zoom in a little bit there, and I'll see we'll make a check, and as you can see, the needle doesn't move. And so from there, we're going to go ahead and we're going to adjust that nut now, and we're just going to back it out just slightly so that we can start going for that measurement. As you can see, it's still not moving that much. We going to make another adjustment here, and since this dial indicator is in inches, the maximum we want to go is 1/1000th of an inch. That'll be around 0.02 millimeters, I believe. And so ideally we want to get anywhere between 0.5 of an inch to 1/1000th of an inch. And so we're just going to make another adjustment. We're going to set it back to 0. And remember, it's okay to set it back to 0 because we're measuring the gap, the run out. We're not measuring a distance, so it's okay. And now we're going to make another check. And you'll see we'll get a little bit of movement there. And that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for just about 0.5 to 1/1000th of an inch. We're going to make a big adjustment just to give you an idea of an exaggerated in-play measurement. So now we'll make an adjustment going the other direction to start dialing in that end play. And you can see the needles moving just a little bit within that thousandths of an inch mark, and that's what we're aiming for. And once we have our end play set, then we can just go ahead and fine tune it, maybe make another adjustment and get it dialed in, and from there we're good to go. We can tighten the nut, and a tip to tightening the nut is to have that locking screw pretty tight, so that way when we set the nut and we go to tighten it, it doesn't move. I also use the digital indicator, and the digital indicator measures in millimeters and inches, and I found it to be just a lot better. I mean, it was just spot on. I could just see what the adjustment was, and it was great. Okay, so now that we have everything set, we can take our T-handle and we can go ahead and tighten it back, and then from there we'll torque it down to 11 Newton meters, and then after that we can just go ahead and put our cap back on, the dust cover, and we'll just take a dead blow hammer, like a plastic dead blow hammer. You don't want to use metal, and then just go ahead and just make sure it's set up evenly, hammer it back on, clean off the grease, and then from there we'll just take some brake parts cleaner and clean that rotor, because handling the grease, there's a chance of getting grease on the rotor, and we don't want that grease to come in contact with our pads. After that, we'll just go ahead and we'll bolt the sensor back to the caliper with the bolt that we threaded through, just to kind of keep it in a safe place. After that, we'll go ahead and just torque down that bolt to 11 Newton meters, and then we'll torque down our caliper bolts to 115 Newton meters. And that's it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please comment and subscribe.